My name is Rusty Adams, and I'm the research attorney at the Texas Real Estate Research Center. With the advent of Airbnb and VRBO, it's easier than it's ever been for people to rent out their homes, vacation homes, properties like that for short term, where instead of leasing it for months at a time or years at a time, they're renting it for a weekend. As this has become more prevalent, some property is subject to restrictions on whether they can lease for short terms or not. Well, a few years back, there was a case in the Texas Supreme Court called Tarr versus Timberwood Park, and it created quite a stir in the media, and it was pretty widely hailed as a case holding that you couldn't restrict property by deed restrictions to prohibit short-term rentals. That actually wasn't the case. That actually wasn't what that case said. And so I wrote about that a few years back and described what the case actually said and what it didn't say. Since then, because there's so many short-term rentals and efforts to prevent them, I've examined what cases have come out since Tarr versus Timberwood Park. The two broad categories of regulation on short-term rentals are municipal ordinances or other governmental restrictions, or deed restrictions or restrictive covenants. In this article, we're just talking about restrictive covenants, which are not laws that are put in place by the state or by any city or any kind of governmental authority. They're deed restrictions that property owners put on the property. They're restrictive covenants. They're private. They apply to the land, they run with the land. That's one way that property can be restricted. The first category of cases that we discussed in this article is the interpretation of the restrictive covenants themselves. And the Shack case is one where the court looked at a restrictive covenant, and it said the restrictive covenant that was at issue, first of all, said that the dwellings on the property had to be single-family residences. That was a similar covenant to one that Tarr interpreted, and basically it said that is a structure requirement. It means that a structure on the property has to be a single-family residence, and without more, unless the restrictions specifically say, that just has to do with what kind of building you can put on the property. It doesn't say that it has to be a single family that lives there. The second restriction in the Shack case was a commercial use restriction, also one that was discussed in Tarr. And Tarr came out and said commercial use implies that there's actual commercial activity or a business operating out of a property. It doesn't say that you can't rent the property. And so that's what Tarr said. And in the Shack case, those two questions were answered basically the same. Now, Shack also had a provision that if you rented a property, it had to be rented either to a single family or no more than two unrelated persons. And what it found was at the trial court, they didn't bring forth any evidence that that had actually been violated. In other words, what the Shack case basically says is, we're ready and willing to uphold these restrictions, but you have to prove your case. And so it didn't necessarily come right out and say the restriction on single family or unrelated people would be enforced or would not be enforced. What it said was, we don't reach that question because there wasn't any evidence in front of the court. The court generally will enforce a restrictive covenant as long as it's not illegal or against public policy. But the restrictive covenant has to say what it means. It has to specifically prohibit whatever kind of behavior or building is not allowed. Some cases are decided at the trial court level in summary judgment. What that means is the parties put their evidence on paper in front of the court, and the court decides that there's no genuine issue of material fact, and so it'll enter summary judgment. and decide the case without any testimony, without having a full-blown trial. What happened in the Duncan case was the parties moved for summary judgment and the court denied that. And in this particular case, the court allowed the appeal to be taken from the denial of summary judgment. So what was before the appeals court was, should this case have been disposed of on summary judgment, or was it proper for them to deny it? And the reason it would be proper for them to deny it is if there were fact issues that had to be decided by a judge or jury at the trial court level. Now, what happened in Gantenbein was there was a restriction that said if the property is occupied by people other than family members, they have to be bona fide servants or assistants. These people were renting out their house to students. The family wasn't living there, and these people were living there. They weren't servants, they weren't assistants, they were just there. And so the court looked at that, and the court said, yes, we're going to enforce that. One thing we're not seeing really yet is a lot of duration restrictions working their way through the courts. I think the reason why is because a lot of the deed restrictions were very similar to the deed restrictions in Tarr. They said single-family dwellings, they said no commercial use. And the holding in Tarr basically told everybody, if that's all it says, then this doesn't prohibit short-term rentals. What does seem to be the case is, if the deed restrictions come right out and say, you can't lease your home for a period less than X days, 7 days, 3 days, 180 days, whatever, that the courts will enforce those. In shack, they were allowed to continue renting. Basically what the court said was, here's how we construe these deed restrictions, and the structure requirements and the commercial use requirements were enforceable. So in Duncan, there really wasn't an indication that the court would not enforce the deed restrictions. What the court basically said was, how these deed restrictions apply to this property depend on facts. And so we're going to send it back to the trial court for a trial on how the law applies to those particular facts. Gantenbein upheld the deed restrictions. Again, that was not a deed restriction about the duration of the lease. It was a deed restriction about who you could lease to, but the court did enforce that. So the second part of the article discusses what happens when someone buys a property, it's subject to deed restrictions, and then later the deed restrictions are amended to prohibit short-term rentals.